I think there will be another independence referendum. Depending on what Theresa May returns with will influence my judgment on the timing of that. And I'm not going to speculate at this stage. We can talk about the likely outcomes of that, but I will wait until I know for sure before setting out my views on the timing. The future relationship between the EU and the UK will be the context in which Scotland would become independent. So the detail of that future relationship will inevitably, whether I like it or not, shape some of the answers to questions people in Scotland would have about the implications of independence. It's about allowing clarity to emerge so that people in Scotland, if they are making this judgment again, can do so in a fully informed way, and I think that's sensible. Critics are perfectly entitled to say what they want. That's democracy. I've got a job to do as First Minister to make decisions in the best interests, as I see them, of the country. But secondly, in terms of Theresa May not listening to me, for a lot of people in Scotland, the last 2 years have demonstrated very powerfully the case for independence. Not only was Scotland's voice ignored in that referendum, since then we've made constructive proposals for compromise, staying in the single market and customs union. They've been completely dismissed. The request of devolved administrations to have a greater say in the negotiation has been cast aside. There's been a raid on the Scottish Parliament's powers, and when the Scottish Parliament said no to that, the UK government's response was to take us to court.
Now is the party's leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford. Thank you very much for being with us on the show today.
Good morning, Sophie.
Now, you've said that the SNP could potentially support a second referendum on Brexit if there are guarantees around a second Scottish independence referendum. I mean, that sounds a bit like an ultimatum. Surely Brexit is too important to play politics with?
Well, we're not playing politics with Brexit because you're right, it's too important, because it's about jobs, it's about prosperity. And we know if there's a hard Brexit, if we're out with the single market and the customs union, there's a very real threat to jobs in Scotland and indeed throughout the rest of the United Kingdom. Fraser of Allender have told us that there's a threat to 80,000 jobs in Scotland. People on average will be £2,300 a year worse off through a hard Brexit. So one of the things we're seeking to do is to say to the Prime Minister that you must keep us in the single market and the customs union. People didn't vote to become poorer, and that's our first objective in everything that we're doing today. I firmly believe that there is a majority in the House of Commons to stay in the single market and the customs union. And first and foremost, we must make sure that that is on the agenda. But we're also making it clear to the Prime Minister that we will not support measures that take us out of the single market and the customs union that will mean that people are at threat and losing their jobs and their livelihoods as a consequence of that. But it's also to remind the Prime Minister that we were told in our own referendum in 2014 that if Scotland stayed within the United Kingdom, that our place in Europe would be secured. Now, of course, in the 2016 referendum, Scotland overwhelmingly voted to stay within the EU by 62 to 38%. We can't be dragged out of the single market and customs union against our will. And what we are saying is if there is to be a people's vote, then we need to make sure that our position is protected. We must have the right that if we are being dragged out of Europe, that we're being dragged out of the single market and the customs union, that we have that ability to determine our own future. And of course, as this conference takes place, there was a huge demonstration yesterday in Edinburgh, talking about up to 100,000 people that marched in support for Scottish independence. There are polls out this morning that show that a majority of the Scottish people would support an independent Scotland and a likelihood of a hard Brexit. So it's very clear that circumstances here are changing. I think people are expressing a very clear opinion that they want to have their rights as European citizens protected. And we'll make sure that we give leadership to that over the coming months.
Let me just get it clear then, because you're clearly saying there that you want to see the UK remaining as part of the single market. I mean, that, as far as I'm aware, is effectively off the table when it comes to the Brexit that Theresa May is trying to negotiate. So if the UK leaves the single market as expected, are you saying that you would then support a second referendum?
Well, what I am saying is that all our efforts in the short term will be about staying in the single market and the customs union. I don't accept this off the table. I do believe that there's a majority in the House of Commons for that, and I would say to each and every MP, and appeal to every MP, that be aware of what you're voting for when it comes to that meaningful vote. Are you prepared to look at your own constituents and make them poorer as a consequence of this? Now, I'll be going to see Michel Barnier on the 25th of October. I'll be going with other party leaders. I'll be going with Vince Cable, with the Greens and with Plaid Cymru. And we'll be making that point that we must make sure that we put that proposition of staying in the single market and the customs union strongly. And I'll be appealing to Labour and Conservative MPs to join that as well. Theresa May is suffering from the fact that she's beholden to her right-wing Brexiteers in her own party. She should govern in the interest of all in the United Kingdom and not simply dance to the tune of our Brexiteers and recognise that the best interests of everybody are about staying in the single market and the customs union. Now, look, hypothetically, if we're not in a position that we can achieve that, then all options will be on the table. We haven't been arguing for a people's vote, but we'll make it very clear if there is to be such a thing, that Scotland's position must be protected. We will not and cannot be dragged out the single market and the customs union against our will. There's an express view and will of the Scottish people to stay in.
So talk about what you said yesterday about another referendum about Brexit, saying that you would back that. I want to know kind of under what terms. Are you thinking about a rerun of what happened in 2016, of that referendum?
Well, I think that's one of the questions that would require to be resolved, what precisely the question in that would be. But, you know, as we veer ever closer to the end of March next year, the cliff edge, there's still no detail at all about what the future relationship might be. And there may not be any detail about the future relationship at the point of exit. I do think that if there is a proposal to give the people another say, then that's something that SNP MPs would back. That said, it won't necessarily resolve the issue Scotland faced in 2016, where we voted to remain, the rest of the UK voted to leave, and we faced exit anyway. But if there's another opportunity to reaffirm our desire to stay in the EU, then I think we would take it.
Right, and so you're talking about a sort of a rerun rather than a referendum on the terms of the deal?
Well, we don't know whether there's going to be a deal yet, which is why I'm not trying to dodge that question, but we don't know yet whether there's going to even be a deal. No deal is certainly still a possibility. What I think perhaps is a slightly bigger possibility just now is what some people have started to term a blind deal, where there's a withdrawal agreement cobbled together but no detail or not sufficient detail on the future relationship. So I think we need to wait and see what comes out of this phase of negotiation before anybody would be definitive about exactly what the terms of that would be. But, you know, as First Minister of Scotland, which voted 62% to remain, standing a matter of months away from being taken out of the EU regardless of that, with no detail about what the future relationship might be, I'm not sure it's surprising that if the opportunity arose, and I don't know whether it will, I would be keen to allow Scotland another opportunity to stay in the EU.
Right, and we know that negotiations are ongoing, and of course, as you mentioned, there are various deadlines. At this point, and I imagine that your answer might be the same, what would the SNP do about a vote on Theresa May's deal, if she gets a deal?
Well, we've always said, and I will say again today, that our bottom line is membership of the single market and customs union. It's not an option without damage to the economy, but it's the least damaging option if the UK is leaving the EU. I cannot envisage the SNP MPs, given that we represent a country that voted so strongly to remain, voting for anything that doesn't at least keep the UK in the single market and the customs union. Beyond that, of course, we need to wait and see what comes out of this phase of negotiations. What I think is very important, though, is, and I'm not a member of the House of Commons, but I think it's important the House of Commons doesn't find itself in the position of choosing between the fire and the frying pan, of allowing the Prime Minister to say, well, you know, here's a bad deal or here's a blind deal, and you have to accept that because the only alternative is no deal. If that's the situation, then I think the House of Commons should assert itself, put sensible options like single market, customs union back on the table. Look, and I've called for this in recent days, look at the option of extending or requesting the extension of Article 50. But that fire or frying pan choice can't be one, in my view, that the House of Commons allows itself to be forced into. You've
also talked, haven't you, about the possibility of a second independence referendum, and you did say you were going to give timings on that, but is that moving? When will you give timings?
Well, I said I would do that, and I said this way back, not summer just past, but last summer, at the end of this current phase of negotiations. Way back when I said that, it looked as if that would be this month in October, but of course it now looks as if it may stretch into November. So when this phase of negotiation ends, this month, next month, whenever that is, I don't know, because I'm not in charge of that timescale. I will set out at that stage what I think the next steps for Scotland should be, given the circumstances we find ourselves in at that time.
I want to talk to you, if I can, about climate change, because there's this report out today, and it's really calling for strong government and fundamental changes to be made in order to keep temperatures down. And the Scottish Government, how much of a priority is that for you? What are you doing specifically to tackle this?
It is a massive priority. The actions the Scottish Government has already taken have been described by the United Nations as exemplary. We initially set targets for reduction of emissions for 2020. We're already ahead of those targets and are toughening up those targets. We've just introduced to the Scottish Parliament new legislation that would make Scotland carbon neutral by 2050, and also, as soon as the science says it's possible to do, make Scotland a net zero country in terms of emissions, not just carbon emissions, but emissions overall. We've been extremely successful in decarbonising electricity. We've been reasonably successful when it comes to waste as well. The big challenge for Scotland, and indeed for all countries now, is to replicate that success in other sectors, in transport, in heat, in agriculture, and we've got big ambitions to do that. I'm biased as First Minister of Scotland, but it's no exaggeration, and I think many people in the UN and elsewhere would agree with this. Scotland is a world leader when it comes to tackling climate change and reducing emissions, and the report today is a reminder of our moral responsibility to continue to do that.
Nicola Sturgeon, if I could ask you as well, from a personal basis, because it does talk about individuals, what changes have you made?
I try to live my life in a way that is mindful of the environment. In my home life, I try to do that. I don't pretend, and I think any leader who pretends to be perfect and doesn't have things that they would still like to do better, then wouldn't be telling the truth. So I accept that responsibility myself, and as a leader, it's my job to make sure we set the overall policy framework that encourages people to do that. So energy efficiency, for example, which is one of the areas, like transport, that impinges a lot on individual behaviour. That's the big challenge for Scotland now. We've been very successful in renewable energy, as I said, decarbonising electricity. But the further down this road we go, the more it does impinge on our individual behaviour, and all of us have to live up to that obligation.